Well, for people who claim to be people of the Word, it's kind of hard to own that. In all honesty, we know very little about our Bible. I mean, it's a pretty big book, and it's really, really old. So old, in fact, that we don't even have the originals. Nobody does. Unless you have a degree in theology or a deep, deep passion and lots of time to study, it's often like a book of magic in our contemporary society, where you take a particular text and simply apply it to your life, and poof, God is with you. Did you ever play that game? I know I did, perhaps in high school, where you're like, okay, I need God's help, I'm going to open the Bible. Okay, He has blocked my ways with hewn stones. Guess I'm not supposed to do that. Do you know what I'm saying? That was funny. Where we pick out verses of the Bible randomly and apply them to our lives. Maybe you didn't play that game. I played that game. The point is we often miss the context, the bigger picture in which the Bible was written, which makes a difference in how we interpret it and how we apply it to our lives. When I was a freshman in college, I took an Old Testament class. Now, mind you, I grew up in a super Christian household, and my mom is here this morning, so I can say I was super Christian, right? Went to church twice on Sundays, sometimes 3, went to a Christian school, so I knew my Bible. But it wasn't until I got to college in that freshman year that I realized the entire Bible was just one story, from the beginning to the end. Now, it's not written chronologically, obviously, but it is one story of the redemption or the salvation of God's people. Do you see where I'm going with this? Perhaps it's time overdue, that we take a step back and look at the big picture. Go through the entire Bible. Over the next 9 months, we're going to take a journey through the biblical story. Discover and explore the different ways that God has covenanted with us. The different ways that God was in relationship with humanity throughout history. Over the course of the year, you will hear stories that you have not heard in a long time if you grew up in the church. And you will find that God is still speaking to us through this ancient text. During this school year, we will discover again, or maybe even perhaps for the first time, the story that calls us back to relationship. Calls us back to God, calls us back to the place where we belong. We live in a world that tries so hard for us to refuse the false stories that claim to give us an identity, a hope, a home, a place to lay our hats. But truly there is only one place that we can call home, a place of belonging, a place where our brokenness is embraced and healed, a place where we are challenged to be more than we thought we ever could be. That is the story of God and the journey of God's people. God is about relationships. Never has God really been about what one should believe or not believe on a particular issue. Simply put, we are created to be in relationship, and that is truly what God is all about. The overarching story of our lives is shaped with God's covenant relationship with us, one that we can follow and weave throughout the scriptures. The story of creation, then of the brokenness, the fall, the sinfulness of humanity, and then the next 1,000 pages of the story of redemption of God's people. And then the part that we are still waiting for, the consummation when Christ returns. So today we're going to start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. Creation. a hotly debated topic, so much so that we have a museum dedicated to it in Cincinnati, offering one of the number of ways to interpret how God created the world. But we're not going to look at this 3,000-year-old text as a science textbook today. What we do as Presbyterians is put the text in his historic and social context, as well as garner what type of literature it is. And today, Ed and I read a poem. And as always, when we approach the text, we seek to listen to God. Now, the first chapter of any book is important. It sets the stage. It invites the reader into a drama. And this chapter of Genesis is no different. It depicts a God who yearns for relationship and creates in a way that welcomes relationship and the dynamic process that the creation is meant to have with its creator. When God creates humanity on that sixth day, we are invited into that creative process, following God's lead, seeing ourselves as tending and caretakers of this world where we bear much of the responsibility to continue the creative process in spirit. It's been an intense year thus far for our world. We've had massive changes and transitions in leadership. We've seen the uprising of people and their opinions in ways our country hasn't seen for a long time. Issues of race, class, gender, health, and the latest, immigration. All of us seem to have this aura of anxiety. Somehow it's different, though, than it's been before. We continue to see the decline of membership in the church across the board in the United States. The anger, the fear, the reactivity has been alarming. The threats of violence and the actual violence has left us wondering about one another, about what side one is on, and about how in the world did we get ourselves into this, and how do we get out of it and warp into another world where all of the craziness is gone and where we can actually live again. But this text can call us back to the beginning as we struggle with what it means to be faithful in this time and in this place, as we experience the unsettling nature of our times. Going back to the beginning can help us recall what this is all about, why we are here, and how we are to live. There are three important things for us as we begin this story of ours, of God and God's people. The first is that it begins with God. Kind of obvious, but that's the core and the reality that we forget so often. Our lives sometimes show something other than what we profess, and because we continue to give ourselves the right to play God, to decide what is good for ourselves and for the world. Yet it's God who initiated all of this relatedness, interconnectedness of all things. And I'm pretty sure that God still has things to say to us. The United Church of Christ has had a tagline for a number of years, and you may see it on your travels, these huge signs in front of their churches that say, God is still speaking. And they're right. God is. And we need to posture ourselves maybe in a way that we can listen, that we can hear God's voice, see where the creative forces of God are still at work in our world, and seek to actively follow God into those places, becoming a part of God's story. The second thought from this text is that often things take time to come into being. There's patience on God's part throughout the creation story, the unveiling of what is to be, rather than instantaneously creating. We and all of this are not simply a product. Rather, Creation is a process by which God is engaging the creation, inviting us into the ongoing creating. One commentator writes, God chooses to take time in creating and endows creatures with creative capacities. God determines not to do the creating alone. God, working interdependently and over time, involves the creatures themselves in creational developments. What creatures do actually counts in the ongoing becoming of the world. In an ongoing world that seems so chaotic, where there's talk of nuclear missiles, mutations of bacteria and of weeds, of families continually breaking up, God reminds us this morning that what God created was good. 6 times it was good. And that 6th day, he doesn't even just say it's good. He says it's very good. And I'm pretty sure God is still saying that to us this day. It is good. John reminds us that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will never overcome it. The light for all people, the hope of Christ, the power of God, regardless of the hardship. Redemption is here among us. God is speaking. Redemption is happening. So instead of being nasty, elbowing our way to make sure we have a place at the table and getting what we can while we can, perhaps our stance as the people of faith could be to trust in God's abundance rather than living like there isn't enough for everyone. To overcome that myth of scarcity our world alleges. Perhaps it's to find good and not the depraved. To entertain hope rather than despair. Seek to be encouraging rather than destructive. This is the beginning of our story. Our story. As it was written so long ago, it's still being written, just as we are still a part of this unfolding of God's world. A world that is good, that has good, where God is still speaking. So may we look up to the stars and see them for what they are. God's power and creative forces among us, and return to God what is God's, the power and place of authority in our lives and in the world. It's not just our lights that shine, it's God's. May we listen for God as the future looms ahead, foggy and unclear, trusting that God is light. God creates what is good, and we are a part of that story. Amen.